Hi, I'm Bonnie Glendenning and I work for Port Blakely. Port Blakely is a sustainable forestry company that has been in the Pacific Northwest since 1864. We're currently on our 5th generation of family owners, and Port Blakely started up in the Seattle area at a mill port, which is how we got the name Port Blakely back in the time of Abraham Lincoln. Now, eventually Port Blakely expanded, and now we have acreage in Oregon and Washington, and we grow trees for wood on over 140,000 acres. Now, when I say we're a sustainable forestry company, what does that mean? Sustainable basically means something that won't run out, something that can keep going and going. So at Port Blakely, sustainable forestry means that when we do harvest, we only harvest a tiny percentage of our acreage. Then we always replant right away, so we're always growing more trees than we're harvesting. Now, imagine that you inherited some land. Your great-great-aunt Mirabelle wanted to leave her property to her youngest living relative, and that happened to be you. Now, normally, in order to get land in Oregon, you would have to work and earn and save for a really long time to be able to afford even a down payment on some property. But for our purposes here today, we're going to imagine that you were able to inherit some land, and also that great Aunt Mirabelle left you enough money to help pay for property taxes every year and enough money to establish a crop. Now, it will be up to you to decide what crop you want to plant on your land. We're really lucky to live here in Oregon because so many things grow really well. Oregon is the #1 producer in the US for all kinds of crops like peppermint, grass seed, blackberries, and hazelnuts. But did you know we're also the #1 producer for a lot of really important wood products? Now let's say you make the decision to plant trees as your crop. You'll need to order some seedlings from a nursery and find a planting crew. At Port Blakely, we plant several different types of trees, but the tree species that grows the very best in this area is Douglas fir. In this part of the state, about 8 out of every 10 conifers you see is a Douglas fir. They grow really well with the sunlight, water, and soil conditions in this part of Oregon. I've sort of just given this away, but I bet you guys can guess what our Oregon state tree is. When we plant new trees, we plant a lot. Forest landowners in Oregon plant about 40 million seedlings every year. At Port Blakely, we plant our seedlings pretty densely, around 420 trees per acre, knowing that competition, mortality, thinning, and disturbances like the fire and the ice storm we had last year will likely remove a number of trees in the next 50 years. Douglas fir trees love the sun, so we plant these trees in full sunlight, not under other species where they won't thrive. In a clear cut like this, we usually prep the site by spraying herbicide once before planting, giving these trees a little head start on the other vegetation they will have to compete with. After planting, we sometimes spray one more time, but that's typically all the spraying we do for the next 50 years. So some people, including the family owners of Port Blakely, choose to plant trees. Trees are a pretty unusual crop. If you were to plant blackberries or corn or some other crop, it might not be a great thing if you had wildlife wandering around in your fields. But if we have wildlife in our forests, we actually want that. It creates a healthier ecosystem. So we want our forests to provide good, healthy habitat for wildlife. And when both species benefit, when wildlife benefits and the forest benefits, we call that a symbiotic relationship. From a wildlife perspective, this is a very popular stage of the forest. The competing vegetation has just been delayed, but it soon comes back with a vengeance in these openings with plenty of rain and full sunlight. Grasses, seeds, shrubs, berries, and insects all benefit from these open conditions and are really abundant here. Birds, rabbits, garter snakes, small mammals, coyote, deer, and even bear all love the young forest and are all part of the food chain that starts with sunlight. As these trees grow larger, something really interesting starts to become more obvious. These trees have layers of branches, and each of these layers of branches or circles of branches is called a whorl. They each represent 1 year of growth on this tree. So this is how it works. The new growth on a Douglas fir tree appears at the top of the tree and at the tips of the branches. Each year at the top of the tree, you'll find a new group of buds. One of those buds is going to grow straight and tall, straight up to the sky, and we're going to call that one the leader. The leader will eventually become part of the trunk of the tree. And around the leader, all the other buds are going to grow into branches. So they're reaching out for sunlight out to the sides. Now each year we get a new leader and we get a new circle of branches, or a whorl. So if we can count the whorls on a tree, we can find out how old that tree is. So once you're able to count whorls, you can find out how old a young tree like this is. If we were to count the whorls on this tree, I could start right in here, and you can see there's a circle of branches, then a space, and then another circle of branches. And I could do that all the way up to the top of the tree and figure out how old this tree is. Now you might notice something kind of interesting here. Some of these whorls have a lot of space between them, and some don't have very much space between them at all. Why do you think that is? Another thing you'll likely notice as your trees get a little bit older is that they are starting to get very crowded. They will eventually naturally select. The trees that get the most sunlight, water, and nutrients will thrive, while the trees that don't may die out. But in managed forestry, we sometimes help this process along. Thinning provides our young, crowded trees with a little more elbow room. When we thin, we remove some of the trees to reduce competition. The thinning crew will look for all of the Ds, dead or dying, defective, diseased, or decaying. Double tops are also not desirable. You can imagine what would happen if you were trying to mill a 2x4 out of a tree that suddenly split into two trunks. When young trees like these are thinned, it's called pre-commercial thinning. They're too small to be taken to the mill, so we leave them on the ground to return nutrients to the soil. If a forest is thinned when it's older, it's called a commercial thinning, and we can usually find mills that will accept these small logs and turn them into wood products. As the trees you've planted grow, they are doing lots of great things for the environment. In addition to providing habitat for wildlife, our trees and roots perform important functions for our rivers, streams, and groundwater. The most obvious is that the roots hold soil in place, stabilizing stream banks and reducing erosion. In Oregon, we have laws that conserve the trees next to our streams and rivers. When you eventually plan your harvest, you'll leave these trees alone because they are doing so many good things to keep our water cool and clean. Speaking of keeping water cool, can you see how all of the leaves and needles help shade the stream? Our forests also work like a filter. Streams form at the lowest point in the land, at the bottom of the hills. So thanks to gravity, anything that does erode flows down toward the water. All of these trees, grasses, shrubs, and plants make it really difficult for sediment to wind its way down to the stream. And as rain falls from the sky, leaves and needles intercept that rainwater and slow it down. Once water makes it to the ground, this riparian area acts like a huge sponge. Some riparian buffers can absorb up to 18 inches of precipitation, which helps prevent flash flooding downstream. Eventually, water passes through the filtering layers of soil and enters into groundwater aquifers. The next thing you'll notice is that these trees are growing into a middle-aged forest, and they're quickly putting on a lot of mass. It's a little bit like you middle school kids, when all of a sudden you start having a huge appetite and eating a whole bunch, and pretty soon you have a teenage growth spurt. Well, trees are doing the same thing at this age. They're putting on a whole bunch of mass because they're using what's around them, their resources, and they're using them pretty quickly right now. So we know that to grow, these trees need sunlight, they need water, they need nutrients, but there's one more thing that these trees need to grow to help them get this big. And it's responsible for about half the mass of this tree. Can you guess what it is? If you guessed carbon dioxide, you were right. Trees capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they sequester that carbon, holding onto it and using it to build wood. At the same time, they return oxygen to the air, another symbiotic relationship. Young growing trees are great at removing carbon dioxide from our atmosphere and locking it up, which can help in the fight against global climate change. And what's really cool is that trees that are harvested and turned into wood products continue to store the carbon for the life of that wood product. There are 700-year-old buildings in Europe that are still storing carbon sequestered from the atmosphere. If you were to create a sketch of a middle-aged forest, you might notice how the structure has started to become more complex. We have the dense canopy above, and we have some smaller trees and vegetation growing from the forest floor, starting a diverse understory. Shade-loving plants like sword fern and snowberry are common in the middle-aged stands. This forest appeals to different wildlife with these new structures and food sources. Birds like chickadees and warblers like it here, along with salamanders, lizards, frogs, squirrels, bobcats, and even elk can be found in this type of forest. Eventually, if Mother Nature is kind to you and you don't have a wildfire or a serious ice or windstorm, the forest you planted and tended will grow into an older stand. You'll notice that now the tree trunks have even more space between them. Competition for resources, weather, and thinning have reduced the number of trees per acre. Look at the size and structure of this mature tree. Notice how far the branches spread out, reaching for sunlight. Big old trees take up a lot more space than those little seedlings you originally planted, don't they? And take a closer look at the forest structure here. Not only is the canopy higher, the understory changes too, often becoming more complex and diverse, with lots of different species growing to different heights. This more mature forest might be attractive to yet another group of wildlife. Here we might find hawks, bats, flying squirrels, owls, or raccoons. As trees grow older, they become more susceptible to decay and insects, attracting woodpeckers who can create holes in the trees. These cavities are homes to up to 50 different types of wildlife in Oregon. Because snags like this often provide homes for so many different kinds of birds and mammals, they are protected by Oregon law. And if they don't present a safety hazard, snags like this will be left standing during harvest. If you're a middle schooler, you'll be in your early 60s by the time these trees are 50 years old. That's a long time to wait for your crops to grow, isn't it? But in the meantime, think of all the great things you helped provide while your forest was growing. You helped create habitat for wildlife, clean water, and found a way to contribute to the fight against climate change. You also had the pleasure of enjoying the beauty of your forest as it grew, maybe bird watching or hiking, camping, or mountain biking. Now that we're ready to harvest, there are Oregon forest practice laws that must be followed. Besides leaving tree buffers near water, you must protect sensitive wildlife sites where endangered species live. Areas with steep slopes have special restrictions, and you will want to discuss the harvest plan with whoever you hire to do the work. Live trees, snags, and fallen logs must be left behind to protect habitat for wildlife. Finally, you'll need to plan ahead to purchase new seedlings to replace the crop you're harvesting. In Oregon, a new forest must be replanted within 2 years of harvest. And then the whole cycle begins again. Trees are a renewable natural resource, and Oregon is a great place to grow them.